Let me go on with the second half of section A of Grunbegriffe, or what we're calling, according to this translation, the basic concepts, but we're also freely interpreting or translating as we go along because of the freedom open to us as readers of this text, where we have words that we assume Heidegger is, and we have evidence that Heidegger is deliberately using words such as grip in German, instead of words like, there is a German word, Konzept, spelled with a K and a Z. There's the word Idee or idea, but he chooses to use Begriffe, or which is often translated concept. But in the text, he uses the play on words of gripping. He shows that he's very aware, as we know anyway from reading other Heidegger texts, of his use of language. But also, the other factor is that because we're thinking of the history of being and also of just history, which are distinct in some way, which can be made distinct in some way, but aren't ultimately different things, because the history of being covers everything, but history taken as a series of events of an object is a kind of limiting way of conceptualizing history. Therefore, we have a freedom to look at how the Greeks would understand a concept, presumably as an idea or the look of things, but they're already in Plato and Aristotle in several different ways, how they understood reason, how they understood the use of logos or speech or language, and et cetera, and then how this was used in the Middle Ages and in our own time. And according to Hubert Dreyfus, Heidegger ended by having maybe 7 or 8 different distinctions rather than the 3 that I'm commonly using, the ancients, the medievals in our own time. But in any case, there's a range of ways that these ideas, these basic concepts, so-called, or principal ideas, or ground grippings, can be understood. The second half of the section A of the introduction goes on to say, on the other hand, the nondescript title has a peculiar decisiveness about it. So what I was just talking about is this simple title, this Grunbegriffe, which can be understood in so many ways. Evidently, nothing arbitrary or peripheral is spoken of here, but only what is necessary and pertains to the main issue. But why isn't this said directly? Well, it is. We only have to listen in the right way. This listening to speech. So again, or speech, Heidegger says, is where thinking happens, rather than what Plato and Aristotle would have said, which is thinking happens in the suke, and then we speak, which is evidenced by the notion that thinking something, speaking within ourselves, within the suke silently, is a worse error than just saying something, because it indicates the malordering of of the soul. All right, going on. Well, it is. We only have to listen in the right way. With the first apprehension of the title, we must immediately begin to practice what will be demanded of us from now on, relinquishing the customary. So, for instance, in terms of relinquishing the customary, I want to try to give an example of why speech is thinking. If you look at, I think it's the first published study of Carl Jung, which is going back to the end of the 19th century. I'm not sure what year it was published, but it had something to do with Jung prescribes the phrase, but he nonetheless called his paper by this the term association test, word association test. He says that's inaccurate because it's not a matter of association, but rather that there is something spoken, the subject hears it, and some process begins, some kinesis within the soul, as it were, as Aristotle would say it, and then the symptom of that going on is the word that they answer back, but it's not an association in like a one-to-one relationship. What he brings out in this study, which has its foot in an earlier time, which we no longer experience due to mass education, is that simple people, the Swiss country people, when they would come in and they had no experience of of introspection, of self-reflecting over why they came to certain ideas, were simply unable to explain their thinking process. And moreover, there were all kinds of irregularities regarding language. And when they had language, which they would have picked up here and there in a newspaper or so, which wasn't the language they would use in their daily life, Jung spoke of a sort of a motor language, that the language in their daily life was something like a physical motor reaction. And it's ambiguous, but it's very hard to understand in the absence of we can probably observe it to some extent in ourselves and in people we know, but in general we're all very much on the side of the theoretical men, as he just spoke of Socrates. Of course, we get a skewed vision of the past because we only get people that were, one in 1,000 in terms of how much introspecting they had done, like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, for example, compared to the general population at the time, not to say the servant or so-called slave populations, which would have, although that's ambiguous, because often, I say servant or slave because often the servants were actually very educated and they were the tutors of the children, and the word slave I find misleading in many cases. Also, they were manumitted in many ways, or given their, I think in the Roman world, generally speaking, because households were the center of organization, the idea of a slave was really the idea of somebody who would, at about age 30 or so, be ready to set up their own household and therefore be manumitted and so-called freed. But the whole point is that everything was centered around the household. So therefore, when you hear things like that a slave can be put to death arbitrarily or whatnot, officially in the Roman law, a son of any age, 80 years old, if his father could put him to death legally, as long as the father is still alive, you weren't the head of the household. But anyway, that's on a side. This idea of people who are not thinking in a introspective way and who are using language in a way not connected to this philosophic death, as it were, death by going into speech. I believe this has something to do with what Heidegger means when he speaks of the primordial language, the language which is really still thinking. So I think when Heraclitus says that most people were asleep, as it were, what he means is that they're mixed in this motor language, the language that gets them here and there in daily life, and also in cliches and in common gossip, but in common gossip in this way that Schopenhauer talks about it, where he says people usually take an inordinate amount of pleasure in repeating commonplaces to one another in conversation, so long as they don't get on any specific topic. And even that's even true today for the most part. But what Heraclitus seems to be indicating is that when he had some thoughts which he spoke, which then broke from whatever this sort of invisible white on white uh, mechanical box that they were motor memory box that they were moving in, this speech um, breaks open the lower level. The speech happens in the world is the point. It's not in the abstracted space of introspection. Um, and it can alter the world, which is obvious in a way, but for the most part, we are so much memory people that we only see these breaks here and there. But in any case, Heidegger is saying speech is thinking, not the soul or imagining or some process that comes before speech is thinking, but the actual speech is the thinking, and the speech is clearly on the same level as a tree or any other object. It's inhabiting that's equal present with everything else, or um, there's other problems here. But it's not equal present, because what Heidegger is telling us is that the ordinary way of understanding everything as present is faulty. That's what the Greeks did, as it were, naturally. So we're thinking of this. Let me continue that sentence a little bit further. With the first apprehension of the title, we must immediately begin to practice what will be demanded of us from now on, relinquishing the customary, which is at the same time the comfortable. We have to assume an attitude whose achievement requires no special knowledge in advance, neither scientific nor philosophical. The latter may be useful for other purposes, but here such knowledge would only be a hindrance. For here only one thing is required: readiness to put the essence of man at risk in thinking that which grounds this essence, and foremost that which grounds everything that man takes for being. Whatever grounds everything and gives ground to everything is itself the ground. So in some ways, this is false, what Heidegger's saying, I believe, because we do have to be primed in what his initial reflections are, but he's saying we have to, but it's uncustomary what he's saying. We have to be open to it. What he's saying is, and I believe there's somebody rehearsing something that they presented as though it came from an introduction to philosophy by Ivo Di Gennaro, which I haven't read, but I thought that what they were saying was wrong, because they made a juxtaposition between Heraclitus, for instance, and the early Greeks has our Parmenides and and Thales, and the rest of the early Greeks as making this discovery. So what they thought is, oh, this discovery, like a million other discoveries, but just as it were, the first rank, more important, was made. So it's like it's discovered that being is. So there's some discovery made that a tree is, that a Niagara Falls is, that being is. And if you think about it that way, then it becomes historical in the metaphysical, in the normal sense of a sequence of events. So like there's some discovery made being, and that being is, and by the early Greeks, Parmenides, being is one. Now you know that being is. Now you have that to work with, and then supposedly Plato goes on to do some things with that, and then the medievals go on to do some things with that. But that's not what Heidegger is trying to make us to show us. Um, Being is not something that that is. Being simply is. Being is not, and so we can think that by seeing that there's not, being is not part of a historical um, development in the sense of discoveries made, or you could even maybe say, Nietzsche could even insist that it wasn't a discovery, but rather a kind of mendacious invention. It's not part of a sequence of discoveries or inventions. It's a radical ground, uh, and it's said rightly, I believe it's right to say, and it's clear that, by the way, that Plato did never ask what being is. He asked, what is the good? He asked, what is justice? He asked, what about individual beings? He didn't ask what being is, and the reason is because they take for granted parousia or presence or availability as uh, being in its being. That's what being in its being is, taken for granted to be without anyone saying anything about it. And what Heidegger is saying is, as it turns out, being isn't this presencing or availability. Rather, being is ultimately has its ground in the nothing, and therefore every time being kind of presences, it withdraws. But the issue here again is you can't say that it showed up in a certain historical moment as that it is. It's being is being. It's not. You can't arbitrarily fix a historical framework around it, so that you'd say we're 2,400 years from the moment uh, that being is was discovered, or something like that. It's There's something fundamentally misleading. That's not, as it were, the insight of being. The insight of being is that being is. It's it's not a that, and it's not a subject matter. It's um, I think if you listen to some of the things Hubert Dreyfus says, where he contrasts with Descartes, there's actually a lot of insight in that, because it's just a flash of the um, awareness that there's no center. You can't arbitrarily you're not starting with an object where you can then order it in some direction in time, or you can order it according to some schema. You're realizing that being is, but what Heidegger wants to say is being in its foundation isn't. All right, so that um, being a failure of um, explication for the moment, being unable to manifest it for the moment, I just made an attempt to give some indication um, of the difficulties, but of the difficulties of withdrawing from our regular way of thinking. Um, there's a saying, when who's the when Gordon Liddy was sent to prison, to some federal prison somewhere. A reporter asked him, "Where are you going?" And he answered with the poetic answer, "Somewhere east of the sun and west of the moon." Um, we really don't know where we are when we speak of being. There's no way to extrapolate out from being to being so that we can orient ourselves. And moreover, being is the nothing, so it's constantly withdrawing, and therefore there's something new is hashing over everything all the time. The final thing he's saying here is, thus the title tells us something about what is to be comprehended there after all. We only have to write the word differently. Ground concepts, Grunbegriffe. Now the title says the ground is to be conceived, grasped, seized, indeed first reached, indeed first only anticipated. We think towards the ground grund of everything. We are not, as it might appear, dealing with quote-unquote concepts as such, with much maligned mere concepts, from which we easily recoil, though we assure ourselves at the same time that they are nothing concrete and lead nowhere. Um, so I'll try as we go forward to bring more concision and piercing power to these ideas, so that they can we can really visualize them, or as it were, Dasein can grasp the play of it. We're flowing in being. We're not. Um, I'll say one last thing here, if I have the time. I've been thinking of, Zizek, like everyone else, thoughtlessly repeats this notion that we know from our own inner sense of things, that we have free will. That's absolutely not true. We don't have the sense of free will most of the time, and the proof of that is that the Greeks didn't even speak of free will at all, and Plato hardly spoke of free will. The closest thing is, sometimes they begin to develop the idea of the motives, that your motive matters rather than what you do, rather than strict liability or the code of honor morality or something like that. Um, this is the closest thing to anything like the question of free will. So therefore, free will, the notion that we have free will, is just ridiculous. Nobody thinks that they have free will. We have moments where we think we're making a choice, but most of the time we're just kind of flowing and being, and things just kind of happen, and then we sort of praise ourselves for our own nature or